The blizzard roared across the land, its icy fingers clawing at the earth as Jacob stood in the barn, looking out at the heavy snow swirling in the wind. The winter storm had come out of nowhere, fierce and relentless, and he was already feeling the cold creep into his bones. He had a fire going inside, but the howling wind made it feel like it wasn't even there. His thoughts were scattered, memories of his late wife, Margaret, and the solitude that had followed her passing. It had been 3 long years since he'd lost her, but even now, his heart still ached, though he would never admit it. It was just then, through the thickening snow, that he saw something, or rather, someone. A figure stumbling through the blizzard, white against white. At first, Jacob thought it was a trick of the wind, a snowdrift moving strangely, but then the figure fell. His heart jolted. Without thinking, he ran from the barn, shouting into the wind, his legs burning with the effort. He was a man of few words, a man who preferred the company of his ranch and animals to that of people. But this was different. This wasn't just some lost soul caught in the storm. It was a woman in a white dress, covered in snow, her face frozen in misery and exhaustion. Jacob reached her quickly, his breath coming in heavy puffs of steam as he dropped to his knees beside her. "Hey, you're gonna be okay," he said, his voice low and rough. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him, the words that came out of her mouth barely a whisper. "He left me at the altar, took everything." Her voice was choked with pain, and it broke something inside of Jacob. He didn't know who this woman was or what her story was, but the raw emotion in her eyes was enough to make his heart ache in sympathy. Without hesitation, he scooped her up in his arms, the weight of her light frame surprising him. He couldn't let her stay out here in this storm, not in that state. He carried her toward the ranch house, her body limp in his arms, snow melting on her skin as he rushed. Inside, the warmth of the fire hit them both like a wave. Jacob laid her down on the old couch by the hearth, gently removing her frozen dress. Her skin was pale, lips blue from the cold. He wrapped her in blankets and moved to start a fire, his hands trembling with the urgency of the situation. As the flames crackled, he returned to her side, his mind racing. She muttered again, words barely audible. Everyone was watching. He said he loved me. Jacob could feel the weight of her pain, her loss. She was still in shock, caught between the storm's rage and the remnants of what had clearly been a life-altering betrayal. He worked swiftly, rubbing her limbs, offering warm water, doing anything he could to get some color back in her cheeks. As he watched her drift in and out of consciousness, he couldn't help but wonder what kind of man could leave a woman in such a state. What had happened to her? The storm raged on, and it quickly became clear that neither of them would be going anywhere anytime soon. The snow piled higher, the wind howling louder. It felt as though the world had closed in around them. Jacob sat by the fire, watching over her, his thoughts drifting to his own past. He had been a widower for 3 years now, but even after all that time, he still struggled to deal with the loneliness that had crept in after Margaret's death. He had always been a solitary man, preferring his ranch to the hustle and bustle of town life. He had been content to live in his little cabin, surrounded by the work he loved, avoiding the world as best as he could. But this woman, this stranger who had stumbled into his life, was something different. She had a story, a life, and for some reason, it felt like she needed him. Jacob glanced down at her, his heart softening in a way he hadn't allowed it to in years. She stirred slightly, and he leaned closer. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you." As the hours passed, the storm didn't let up. Jacob knew that the weather would keep them trapped here for at least 3 days, maybe longer. The thought of being stuck with a woman he knew nothing about seemed impossible. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized there was no other choice. She needed help, and he was the only one around. He didn't know her name yet, but he had already made a decision. She was staying here, and he would help her. It didn't matter who she was or why she was left out in that storm. In that moment, Jacob made a promise to himself and to her that he would give her a fresh start. But as he stared into the fire, the weight of her story began to settle in. If she was who he thought she was, things weren't going to be easy. She wasn't just a woman in need of a roof over her head. There was a debt, a heavy debt, that she couldn't escape, no matter how much he wanted to help her. The storm might have trapped them in this house for now, but Jacob couldn't help but wonder how long that would last. Would he be able to keep her safe? Would he be able to protect her from whatever was waiting for her outside this house when the storm finally passed? As he looked down at her, her face still pale, but her breathing steady, Jacob made another promise, this one to himself. He wasn't going to let her down. Not now, not ever. The storm continued its unrelenting assault for the next few days, and Jacob and Eliza found themselves thrown together in a world of awkward silences and tentative companionship. The first day was filled with the practicalities of survival, keeping the fire going, making sure there was enough water, and ensuring that both of them stayed warm. By the second day, the silence began to break, replaced by the stories they shared. Jacob told her of his wife Margaret, how their marriage had been filled with quiet regret, her dreams of living in town clashing with his desire for a quiet life on the ranch. He admitted how, after her passing, he had felt a sense of relief, a feeling he never expected from a man who was supposed to love his wife. Eliza, in turn, shared her own heartache, her father's debts that led her to a life of desperation, her mother's illness that kept her away from home, and how she had seen the marriage to William Pritchard as her only escape. She confessed that the romantic letters William had sent her were nothing more than lies, a clever facade that masked the truth of his coldness and cruelty. By the third day, the truth was undeniable. Eliza couldn't go back to town, not with the debt and the shame weighing so heavily on her. Jacob, in his quiet way, offered a solution. "Stay here," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "You can work as a housekeeper. I'll pay your wages toward the $800 debt." Eliza hesitated, her mind racing with the implications. "People will talk," she said, her voice tinged with doubt. "They already are," Jacob replied flatly. "But at least this way, you'll survive." It wasn't an ideal solution, but it was the only one that made sense. Eliza agreed, and Jacob quickly built a partition wall in the cabin to give her a private space. Life on a ranch was hard, but Eliza adapted quickly, learning how to cook on the wood stove, haul water from the well, and tend to the chickens. Each small victory, bread that didn't burn, a pantry organized with care, gave her a sense of accomplishment she hadn't known in a long time. Jacob watched her with a quiet respect, noting her resilience and the quiet competence she brought to every task. As the days passed, he started to see her not as a stranger, but as a partner, someone who could handle herself on the frontier. Their first trip to town together, though, reminded them both of the reality they were facing. The moment they entered the mercantile, the atmosphere grew tense. Women whispered behind their backs, and the shopkeeper barely greeted them. When they went to the Pritchards' mercantile, Eliza's father, Amos, confronted them. He demanded payment for the full $800 debt, but Jacob stood firm. "She'll pay every penny honestly earned," he said, his voice unwavering. As they left town, the weight of the judgment from the townsfolk hung heavy, but neither of them spoke. That night, as Eliza lay awake, tears came unbidden. The thought of working for 16 months to pay off a debt she never should have owed was overwhelming. Jacob, sitting nearby, said nothing at first, but finally spoke, his voice softer than it had been in days. "Then we'll work for 16 months. It'll be worth it." His words, simple but true, marked the beginning of something more, an understanding that whatever happened, they would face it together. Yet, the storm was not over. A letter arrived soon after, carrying news of Eliza's mother's worsening condition. The $200 needed for her care was more than Eliza could manage, and as she sat in the dim light of the cabin, she felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. "I can't save her," she whispered. I can't even save myself." Jacob, watching her, his hand almost reaching out to comfort her, felt something stir within him. The tension between them was growing, unspoken, but undeniable. Still, as the night wore on and the fire crackled in the hearth, they said little more. Jacob, for all his gruffness, understood the struggle of a woman who had been abandoned by the world, and Eliza, despite everything, found herself trusting him more than she ever thought possible. But as the storm outside raged on, so did the storm inside them both, one of doubt, fear, and hope, all tangled together in a way neither could ignore. The days that followed would test them in ways they hadn't imagined, but for now, they had no choice but to face them together. The routine of daily life on the ranch became a rhythm neither Jacob nor Eliza had anticipated, but both came to rely on. As the weeks passed, small moments of intimacy began to emerge from the mundane tasks they shared. Each morning, they sat together over coffee, the warmth of the drink contrasting with the still cold that lingered in the air. Eliza began reading aloud to him while she worked, starting with simple primers and gradually moving to books Jacob had never bothered to read. In turn, Jacob taught her the ropes of ranch life, how to braid ropes, care for the animals, and mend the fences that had fallen into disrepair. Though their interactions were often quiet, there was something growing between them, a slow, steady bond forged through mutual respect and an unspoken understanding. They began to notice each other in ways that went beyond the employer-employee dynamic. Small touches in passing, lingering glances, and shared laughter when something went wrong. Eliza, once unsure and lost, started to find confidence in the rhythm of ranch life, making mistakes but learning quickly. The most notable of these was the cooking. She managed to make an edible loaf of bread, her first success after many attempts, and Jacob couldn't help but smile at the pride she took in it. For the first time since Margaret's death, Jacob felt the stirrings of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: connection. As winter turned into early spring, their bond deepened, each of them finding in the other a mirror of their own brokenness and, slowly, the possibility of healing. Jacob, however, kept a secret that he was too afraid to share. Unknown to Eliza, he had quietly sent $200 to the sanitarium in Boston for her mother's care, selling his prize breeding bull to cover the cost. When the ranch foreman questioned him about the sale, Jacob merely shrugged it off, saying some things matter more. He couldn't bear to see Eliza's pain, and the thought of her mother's suffering, even from miles away, pushed him to do what he could. Eliza, meanwhile, remained unaware of this act of kindness, but it didn't go unnoticed in her heart. On the rare occasion that they ventured into town together, the awkwardness of being seen as an unmarried couple was palpable. One such trip was particularly tense when Amos Pritchard confronted them at the Mercantile. He insisted that Eliza's debt stood and that no amount of wages could ever erase the disgrace she had caused. Jacob, not one for confrontation but deeply protective of Eliza, held his ground, stating, "She'll pay every penny honestly earned." The town's judgment was a heavy burden on Eliza, and as they left the Mercantile, her eyes filled with frustration and despair. That night, back at the ranch, Eliza's emotions overflowed, and she finally broke down, expressing the hopelessness she felt about ever being free of the debt. Jacob, for the first time, spoke as though their struggles were shared, not just her burden to bear. "Then we'll work for 16 months. We'll get through this together," he said, and in his voice was a promise that, for better or worse, she wasn't alone. The quiet strength in his words, paired with the unwavering sincerity in his eyes, gave Eliza the strength to carry on. But it wasn't just the hardship that kept them bound together. A letter arrived one day, informing Eliza that her mother's condition had worsened and that another $200 was needed for her care. This news struck Eliza harder than anything had in weeks, for it seemed to confirm her worst fear, that she would always be in debt, always running from something she could never escape. She cried bitterly, the weight of the world on her shoulders. Jacob watched her, torn between offering comfort and respecting her space. But as the days passed, he began to realize that the feelings growing between them weren't just about survival or guilt. It was something deeper, something neither of them could ignore, though neither dared to acknowledge it aloud. Despite the challenges, they began to see each other in ways they hadn't before. Jacob, with his unspoken love for her resilience and strength, and Eliza, with her growing understanding of Jacob's quiet, unassuming heart. Late one night, they found themselves sitting by the fire, both unable to sleep. It was then that the conversation shifted. Eliza, exhausted and raw, admitted that she had never loved William Pritchard. She had only agreed to the marriage because it was the only option left to her. "I just wanted to be free, to not be at the mercy of a man like him," she confessed. Jacob, his voice low but sincere, replied, "I didn't love Margaret the way I should have. We were strangers who shared a house, but we never really knew each other." In the quiet that followed, there was an understanding between them, an acknowledgement of their shared brokenness. They leaned closer, their faces just inches apart, the air thick with unspoken emotions. But before anything could happen, a sudden crash outside interrupted them. Startled, they both grabbed their rifles and rushed outside to find a wolf in the chicken coop, threatening the animals. Together, they worked in tandem to scare the wolf off, their adrenaline surging as they returned to the house, laughing from the thrill of the chase. As they entered the warm cabin, their laughter faded and the tension between them shifted. They were no longer just two people thrown together by circumstance. They had become something more, something neither of them fully understood. But one thing was clear: they were changing, and the feelings they harbored for each other were no longer easy to ignore. The storm outside may have passed, but the storm inside their hearts was just beginning, and neither of them knew where it would lead. As the winter months bled into spring, the unspoken tension between Jacob and Eliza grew. They were no longer just employer and employee. The bond between them had deepened into something neither could easily name. The small, intimate moments they shared, working side by side, their fingers brushing when passing tools, the quiet conversations that stretched late into the night, had shifted into something more. Jacob, who had never allowed himself to care about anyone since Margaret, found himself drawn to Eliza in ways that both terrified and comforted him. She was no longer the abandoned bride he had taken in out of necessity. She had become a part of his life, a partner in a way that went beyond the confines of the arrangement they had made. Eliza, too, felt the change. The growing affection she had for Jacob stirred deep inside her, but the shadow of her past and the crushing weight of her debt kept her from acknowledging it fully. Every day she worked for him, every payment made toward the debt, was a reminder of how far she had fallen, from the romantic dream of marrying William Pritchard to the reality of this humble life. Yet, in Jacob's quiet strength, she found solace. There was no judgment in his eyes, no attempt to force her to be something she wasn't. Still, neither of them could escape the whispers of the town, and the rumors about their relationship only grew louder. It wasn't long before Jacob found himself once again facing the small-minded judgment of Elkridge's residents. The gossip about him and Eliza being more than employer and employee was everywhere, at the mercantile, in the church, and even among the ranch hands. "He's got himself a mistress," they'd say. "No woman stays for just wages." It gnawed Jacob, but he said nothing, choosing instead to focus on the work at hand. But one day, the gossip came to a head. Eliza had gone into town alone to gather supplies, and while she was there, the town women, led by Mrs. Henderson, cornered her at the mercantile. "You should leave," Mrs. Henderson told her, her voice sharp with disdain. "You're ruining a good man's reputation. This is more than just wages, isn't it?" Eliza, taken aback by their vehemence, could feel the heat rise in her chest. I'm not doing anything wrong, she protested weakly. Then why are you still here? Mrs. Henderson pressed. If you have any decency, you'll go. Before it's too late. Eliza, humiliated and rattled, fled the mercantile, her heart pounding in her chest. The ride back to the ranch was a blur. She had never felt so exposed, so ashamed. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't asked to be abandoned by a man who promised to love her. She hadn't asked to be trapped in a debt she never should have owed. Yet, here she was, caught between her desire for independence and the reality of her circumstances. When she arrived back at the ranch, Jacob could see that something was wrong. The normally reserved woman was shaken, her face pale with anger and frustration. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low with concern. Eliza looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hurt and defiance. "They want me to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "They think I'm ruining your life, that I'm nothing but trouble." Jacob clenched his jaw, anger flaring in his chest. "Don't let them tell you that," he said, his voice firm. "You haven't ruined anything. You've worked hard, and that's all that matters." He wanted to say more, to assure her that her presence had changed his life for the better, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he took a step closer and placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle. "Don't listen to them," he repeated, his voice softer now. "You're more than what they say." The next few days were tense. Jacob could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on him. But he refused to back down. One morning, he found a notice on the bulletin board at the post office. The town council had called a meeting. It was to address the moral decay in the community, and Jacob knew without a doubt that the subject of their discussion would be him and Eliza. He had never been one for town meetings, but this time he knew he couldn't avoid it. The meeting was held in the town hall, a large, cold building that echoed with the murmurs of the townspeople. Jacob arrived early, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on him as he walked in, whispers following him like a shadow. He sat at the back, Eliza by his side, her face pale with anxiety. The town council took their seats, and the meeting began. It didn't take long for the accusations to start. "Jacob Thornton is harboring a woman of questionable morals," one of the elders, Mr. Adams, declared. "It's bad enough that he's living with her unmarried, but what's worse is that he's enabling her to stay here. He's corrupted this town's moral fabric." Another voice chimed in. "This kind of behavior cannot be tolerated. It sets a dangerous precedent for our children." Jacob sat still, his fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the heat of their judgment, but he refused to show weakness. When it was his turn to speak, he stood, his broad shoulders squared. "I'm not here to explain myself to anyone," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I know who I am, and I know what's right. Eliza is working hard, paying off a debt that she didn't owe in the first place. She's earning her keep, and she's earned my respect. If that's a crime, then so be it." He paused, looking around the room at the angry faces. "But if you want to judge her, you're going to have to judge me too. She's my employee, my business. If anyone has a problem with that, they can come talk to me directly." The room fell silent, the tension thick in the air. For a moment, no one spoke, and Jacob felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this would be enough to silence the rumors. But then, as if on cue, Mrs. Henderson stood up, her voice cutting through the silence. "It's not just your business, Jacob. It's the town's business. We cannot allow this kind of behavior to continue. We cannot let this woman corrupt our community." Jacob turned to look at Eliza, who was staring down at her hands, her face a mask of humiliation. He could feel the weight of the moment, the pressure building in his chest. But he refused to let her bear this burden alone. "This is my ranch," he said, his voice loud and unyielding. "And Eliza Hartford is my employee. Anyone who has a problem with that can come and talk to me. But I won't let anyone." He was cut off by a loud crash outside. Eliza jumped, her eyes wide with fear. Without thinking, Jacob grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet. They rushed outside, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sight that greeted them was enough to stop them both in their tracks. A wolf, its fur matted with snow, prowling near the chicken coop. The sudden crisis jolted them into action. They grabbed their rifles, working together as a team, each of them acting without hesitation. The wolf was driven off, and as they stood there, panting and covered in snow, they exchanged a look, one that held more than just survival. It was a recognition of something deeper, something neither of them had fully admitted before. Despite the chaos, despite the pressure of the town's judgment, something had shifted between them. They had survived the storm together, and whatever happened next, they would face it as partners. But as they walked back toward the ranch, their laughter still echoing in the cold night air, they both knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. And yet, there was a certain certainty now, a bond formed not just out of necessity, but out of a growing, undeniable connection. The storm might not have passed, but at least now they were in it together. Jacob's heart was still pounding from the wolf scare when the unexpected visit came. He and Eliza had spent the evening working together, their shoulders brushing as they went about the usual chores, a quiet harmony settling over them. The intimacy that had once been fraught with hesitation was now something comfortable, something they both leaned into as a refuge from the storm of judgment that swirled around them. But that peace was shattered when a knock echoed through the door late the next morning, rousing them from the calm they had carefully built. Jacob stood from the chair by the fire, a cold weight of apprehension settling in his stomach as he made his way to the door. Standing outside, in the harsh light of the morning, was Sheriff Davenport, flanked by 2 deputies. His face was grim, his eyes hard with the weight of something serious. Jacob's heart sank. "You need to come with us," Davenport said, his voice flat, a statement rather than a question. Jacob glanced at Eliza, who had frozen where she stood by the stove, her face pale with dread. "What's this about?" Jacob asked, his voice steady but tense. The sheriff's eyes flickered, not meeting Jacob's. "It's about Eliza Hartford. She's under arrest." Jacob's blood ran cold. "For what?" he demanded, his voice rising. Davenport's expression tightened, and he motioned for one of his deputies to step forward, the man holding a set of papers. "The charge is theft," the deputy said, his voice stiff. "Of wedding gifts, silver candlesticks, valued at $500. So to be taken when she fled the wedding." Jacob's mind raced. It didn't make sense. He knew Eliza had left the wedding in a rush, but she hadn't taken anything with her. This was nothing but another scheme, another lie. But the sheriff wasn't listening. "This is a legal matter now," Davenport said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She needs to come with us." Jacob took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "You can't do this," he growled. "This is a lie. You're arresting the wrong person." Eliza, her face a mixture of confusion and terror, took a step back. "I didn't take anything," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I don't even have the candlesticks." But the sheriff was already motioning for her to step outside. "I don't have a choice. The charges are filed, and we got to take her in." Jacob's frustration boiled over, but he knew there was little he could do. He couldn't fight the law, not when it was this far gone. He turned to Eliza, his voice soft but urgent. "Don't worry. I'll fix this. I swear to you." But even as he said the words, the heaviness of the situation settled over him like a shroud. The deputies followed Eliza out of the cabin, and Jacob watched helplessly as they led her away, her shoulders slumped with defeat. As the door closed behind her, Jacob's mind spun with 1,000 thoughts, each one more frantic than the last. What had happened? Who had made these charges and why? And most importantly, how would he clear Eliza's name? He didn't know how much time passed before he moved, but when he did, it was with the clear intention to do whatever it took to get Eliza back. Without another word, he grabbed his coat and set out for town, determined to find answers. His heart was a tangled mess of anger and worry, his mind running over every possibility as he made his way toward the sheriff's office. When he arrived, the town seemed eerily quiet. The usual bustle of the market and the hum of town life felt distant, overshadowed by the storm that had been brewing for months. Jacob marched into the sheriff's office, where Davenport and his deputies were gathered. Davenport looked up when Jacob entered, his expression unreadable. "I'm here to get her back," Jacob said, his voice firm. "I'm not leaving without Eliza." The sheriff didn't flinch, but there was a flicker of something, maybe regret, behind his eyes. "It's out of my hands," Davenport said quietly. "The charges are serious, and they're coming from Amos Pritchard. He claims she stole the candlesticks when she ran away from the wedding." Jacob's stomach twisted at the mention of Pritchard's name. The man had never liked him, but Jacob had never imagined he would go this far. "Amos Pritchard is lying." Jacob spat, his fists clenched. "I know Eliza. She didn't take anything. He's just trying to get her back under his control." Davenport sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to tell you, Jacob. I can't ignore the evidence that's been presented." Jacob's frustration boiled over. "Evidence? What evidence? This is nothing but a smear campaign." He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. "I'm not leaving without her," he said again, his voice quieter but no less determined. "I'll do whatever it takes to clear her name." Davenport hesitated, then glanced at the deputy beside him. "The judge is holding a hearing tomorrow," he said reluctantly. "But you'll have to get Pritchard to drop the charges. If you can't do that, the trial will go ahead and Eliza will be stuck in jail." Jacob nodded, his mind already working on a plan. He had to get to Pritchard. He had to find a way to make him see reason before the trial. But as he left the sheriff's office, his heart felt heavy with the knowledge that time was running out. The next day, he set out to find Amos Pritchard. The man was at the mercantile, surrounded by townsfolk who eyed Jacob with suspicion as he entered. Pritchard looked up, his expression smug. "Well, if it isn't the hermit rancher," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "What do you want?" Jacob's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm here about Eliza," he said. "The charges. I need you to drop them." Pritchard raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying the situation. "Drop the charges? What makes you think I'd do that? She humiliated me in front of the entire town." Jacob took a step forward, his voice low but firm. "You don't have to do this, Amos. Eliza is not a criminal. She didn't steal anything from you." Pritchard's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "That may be true, but she ruined my family's name. I'll never forgive her for that." Jacob knew that appealing to Pritchard's sense of honor was pointless. The man was too consumed by his pride to see reason. "You're punishing her for something she didn't do," Jacob said, his voice hardening. "And you're dragging this town through the mud in the process." Pritchard crossed his arms, looking down at Jacob with disdain. "If you want her free, then pay the price. $500. Or you'll both be paying a lot longer than that." Jacob's mind raced. He couldn't let Pritchard win. He couldn't let this man control Eliza any longer. But as he stood there, he realized that Pritchard was right about one thing. There was a price to be paid. And it wasn't just money. It was going to take everything Jacob had to save Eliza, but he would do it, no matter what it cost him. Jacob left the mercantile with a sense of resolve. He couldn't let Pritchard have a last word. As he rode back to the ranch, he knew he had only one choice left. He had to find William, Pritchard's son. William was the only one who could testify to the truth, the only one who knew that the charges against Eliza were nothing but a lie. He had to find him, and he had to convince him to help. And so, with the weight of everything on his shoulders, Jacob set out for the border town, knowing that the next few hours could change everything for Eliza and for him. The dusty road stretched before Jacob as he rode out, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts, each more urgent than the last. Eliza was in jail, wrongfully accused, and he was on a mission, no, a quest, to set things right. The weight of the entire situation sat heavy on his chest. He had never imagined his life would become so tangled with the fate of a woman he had once rescued from a blizzard. But now, as he pushed his horse harder toward the border town, the only thought in his mind was how to free her. The sheriff had promised a trial, and the charge was theft, but Jacob knew that this was about more than just a few stolen candlesticks. This was about Amos Pritchard's pride, about control, about a vendetta that was far from over. But there was one thing Jacob was sure of. He wasn't going to let Eliza be destroyed by lies. The thought of her, locked up and helpless, made his blood boil. He could hardly believe this was the same woman who had come to his ranch a mere months ago, broken and humiliated, now standing trial for something she didn't even do. The road ahead seemed endless, and every bump in the trail reminded him that time was running out. He had to find William Pritchard, and he had to do it fast. Jacob had never been fond of going into town, much less to confront someone like William Pritchard, but he knew that if anyone could help, it would be him. The relationship between father and son had been strained for years. William, the only son of Amos Pritchard, had left the family estate years ago, opting for a life in the city, away from the shadow of his father's manipulative grasp. Jacob had always heard whispers of William's resentment, but never had he imagined it would come to this. The town he was heading toward was small, a crossroads where merchants and travelers stopped to trade, but it also had a way of keeping secrets. Jacob had been there before, back when he had worked to expand his ranch, and he remembered the quiet tension that hung in the air. Now, the tension was palpable. He hoped that William was still there, that he could be reasoned with, that he could see past his father's lies and tell the truth. He rode into the town, the sound of his horse's hooves on the cobblestones ringing through the empty street. He headed straight for the boarding house, where William had been known to stay whenever he passed through. When Jacob arrived at the door, his knuckles rapped hard against the wooden frame, the sound echoing in the quiet morning air. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a tall figure with dark eyes that held a flicker of recognition before they narrowed with suspicion. William Pritchard stood before him, dressed in the fine clothes of a man who had lived in the city too long for his own good. His dark hair was combed neatly, and his posture was stiff, as if he had never quite shed the arrogance that came with his privileged upbringing. "What do you want, Thornton?" William's voice was cold, as if there were no love lost between them. Jacob didn't hesitate. "I need your help. It's about Eliza." William's face shifted slightly, a faint glimmer of something, guilt perhaps, flashing in his eyes before he quickly masked it with indifference. "I'm not interested in your problems," he said, starting to close the door, but Jacob quickly shoved a booted foot in the way, stopping him. "This is about more than your father's pride, William. It's about a woman's life. Eliza didn't steal those candlesticks, and you know it." The words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment, William didn't respond. Jacob could see the struggle on his face, torn between his loyalty to his father and the undeniable truth he had to face. Finally, William sighed and stepped back, motioning for Jacob to enter. "You've got 10 minutes, he muttered, his voice still laced with disdain. Jacob stepped inside, his heart pounding as he watched the man who could either make or break Eliza's future. Once inside, Jacob wasted no time. "I know the truth, William. Your father is trying to destroy Eliza, and you're the only one who can stop him. Those candlesticks are a lie. Your father made that story up." William looked at him, his face unreadable. "My father's a liar, Jacob. I know that, but I'm not going to get involved in this mess. I got my own life now." Jacob's voice softened, the urgency rising within him. "You're the only one who can help. You know as well as I do that your father would do anything to control her, and right now, he's using the law to do it. If you don't step in, Eliza will spend months in jail, and I'll be damned if I'll let that happen." William's eyes flickered with emotion, but he quickly pushed it away, crossing his arms over his chest. "I can't just go back to Elkridge and confront him. You don't understand the power he has. If I go back, he'll cut me off for good. Jacob took a step forward, his voice resolute. Then you go back to Elkridge for something that matters more than money. You go back for the truth. You go back for Eliza. There was a long silence, and then, finally, William nodded. Fine, he said, his voice low but steady. I'll help you, but we have to do this carefully. If I'm going to stand against him, I need to make sure he doesn't have anything on me. Jacob exhaled in relief. Thank you. Without another word, they gathered their things and set out for Elkridge, the weight of the situation pressing down on them both. The journey back to Elkridge was tense, the miles stretching out like an eternity. By the time they arrived, the town was already buzzing with rumors about Eliza's arrest. The streets were alive with gossip, and Jacob could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on him as he and William made their way toward the courthouse. Jacob's stomach churned with the knowledge of what lay ahead. The trial was set to begin that afternoon, and he knew there was little time to prepare. But with William by his side, he felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. They arrived at the courthouse just as the judge was taking his seat, the room filled with the heavy scent of tension. The town was packed, every seat taken by curious onlookers, eager to see what would happen. Eliza sat at the table, her hands folded in front of her, her face pale but resolute. Jacob's heart ached at the sight of her, knowing how much she had suffered already. But as William stepped into the room, the crowd grew quiet, their eyes shifting toward him. He walked to the front, his eyes meeting his father's for the first time in years. Amos Pritchard, standing at the other side of the room, looked livid at the sight of his son, but William didn't flinch. He took his place beside Jacob, his gaze fixed firmly on the judge. The trial began, with the town's lawyer presenting his case. The story of the missing candlesticks was told again, each word carefully chosen to paint Eliza as the thief, the woman who had stolen from the family that had once promised her everything. But when it was Jacob's turn to speak, he stood tall, his voice unwavering as he defended Eliza's innocence. I know Eliza. She didn't steal anything from anyone. She's worked harder than most of you here, and she deserves nothing less than respect. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but Jacob held his ground, his words echoing through the courtroom. Finally, it was William's turn. He walked to the stand, his face set in determination. My father is lying, he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Those candlesticks were never stolen. They were sold long before the wedding. The debt was fabricated to trap Eliza. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Jacob felt a surge of relief as he watched William speak the truth. My father manipulated me, and he manipulated Eliza. But I'm not going to stand by and let him destroy her life. She deserves freedom, and she deserves the truth. The room went silent, the weight of William's words settling heavily on everyone. Amos Pritchard stood up, furious, but the judge raised his hand to silence him. Enough, he said. The truth is clear. The charges are dismissed. Eliza's eyes welled up with tears as the courtroom erupted into applause. But Jacob was already at her side, his hand reaching for hers. It's over, he said softly, his voice filled with relief. Eliza looked up at him, her face softening with a smile. Thank you, she whispered. I never thought this day would come. As they walked out of the courthouse, Jacob could feel the weight lifting from his shoulders. They had won, but the victory was bittersweet. There was still much to rebuild, but for the first time, Jacob realized that what he and Eliza had wasn't just about survival. It was about love, trust, and the possibility of a future together.